They will be moving carefully. The one thing, too, that we're going to be following closely are these priceless works of art. And that's what we've also heard from officials this building was packed with statues, with paintings, with stained glass. They had the largest rose stained glass, about 10 meters big. It was the largest one ever built at that time. Stained glass is quite fragile, though, so it's likely that any sort of flame and heat could destroy that very quickly. You also have the statues of the 28 kings of Israel that was also in that building. These are all things that, once these flames are under control, that they're going to take stock of to see what has survived. Hundreds of years of history crammed in that building. We have to go back to the 12th century when it was started construction. Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned emperor in that building. There's a lot of history connected to it, and tonight, as we look at these pictures, a lot of that history is now in the ashes there of Notre Dame.
Right, when looking at those images, it's hard to imagine, at least in parts of it, that any of that artwork could survive following what we've seen here. Again, what we are hearing from police is that they're saying at this hour no injuries and no deaths resulting from this devastating fire. As you see a helicopter there above the scene over Notre Dame. This is, guys, are these live? We're looking at live pictures right now. So, again, part of the structure does remain intact. You can see where they were doing the renovation work. I think we still have some of the video from earlier where we saw both the spire come down and other parts of the roof come down at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris as we come up on 8:30 now. There it is. 8:30 Paris time. A firefighting operation that will no doubt go on well into the night, if not for days now, as police continue and firefighters continue to do their work at Notre Dame Cathedral. But to reset, again, these are images from earlier. It hasn't appeared as though firefighters have been able to make much progress.
That's pretty cool looking.
Part of that's because they haven't been able to get very close to it. We have seen now some water being poured onto Notre Dame Cathedral as the fire just continues to burn there. They have that a cordon set off, which they're trying to keep people as safe as possible, and people in Paris, the mayor in Paris is asking people to stay as far back as possible. I think we have another eyewitness, actually CBS employee on the scene, Dennis Wilkins. Dennis, are you with us?
I am.
Dennis, where are you and what are you seeing?
I'm on a hilltop in the Latin Quarter near the Pantheon, at the intersection of Rue Con and I'm at a cafe with my family, and we're looking on the burning still now of Notre Dame, where we had spent yesterday. And the steeple was still standing when we arrived on the block, and in flames it went from white into a kind of a golden hue, and there were black clouds as well. And it burned and burned, and there was a stunned disbelief, and then it turned to utter sadness. We had crowds around me, the Pantheon is behind me, people crying, and we watched the steeple fall. It was just incredibly tragic, and it's an amazing scene. It's very emotional here. People are very upset. People are, of course, have their cell phones up and filming this, but it's a state of shock here. It's quite amazing.
I can only imagine what it's like watching there in person. We know what we're seeing on television here, and it has been awful to watch. And we are now hearing that the cathedral sits on an island. Police are now telling us that that entire island is being evacuated. One would presume that we don't know whether that involves firefighters or not. If it did, that would set them back even further. But look at the pictures that we've seen. Can we go back to that wide view if we could for a moment, please? This is what you're looking at tonight. If you're living in Paris or if you're visiting Paris, smoke consuming the sky, one of the world's most famous buildings that is so meaningful to so many, burning. The roof of Notre Dame has collapsed. The spire has collapsed. and firefighters are doing anything they can to prevent any further damage. Notre Dame Cathedral, again, was under a $6 million renovation. That's been taking place for some time now, and as Elaine Cobb, who's on the scene there in Paris, has noted ably, that they've tried to keep normal traffic going throughout the cathedral as this construction project has taken place. A very delicate and very difficult one, because you're talking about parts of the cathedral, the wood, other pieces of it being 800 years old. And that's what they've been trying to update. As we rejoin Elaine Cobb and as the president of France arrives on the scene, Elaine?
Yes, Emmanuel Macron has now arrived at Notre Dame Cathedral. He's accompanied by the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe. They are making their way to nearer the scene, or as near as they can safely get, because, of course, the danger is of the church collapsing onto people or onto nearby buildings. So we're hearing the entire Ile de la Cité, that entire island, is being evacuated at the moment by police and by firefighters, because they are concerned of the fire spreading rapidly if it takes hold of anywhere beside the cathedral.
So Ile de la Cité, talk about that, Elaine. If that is, and in fact it is being evacuated, how many buildings, how many shops, how many people, how many blocks are we talking about?
Well, the Ile de la Cité has, in fact, a church. The courthouse is just across the road. It, however, is far enough that it should be all right. But there's a hospital just beside the church. It's just one block over, and they are being evacuated. They're also right beside it. There are narrow streets with a lot of restaurants and cafes and souvenir shops, and all of that has been cleared. They're trying to get everybody out of the apartment buildings there. They're all very old buildings, so there will be a lot of wood, a lot of old stone, and because they're all packed in on top of each other, the fear is that if the fire jumped across the very narrow street, that it could start a major blaze in several of those buildings, buildings which are home to people who live there all year round, as well as to the cafes and restaurants that people visit when they are visiting Paris.
Elaine, when was this construction project supposed to be finished?
It was due to be finished sometime later this year or next year, but it was something that it took some delays already. So they were looking for $70 million for the urgent renovations, and had hoped, in fact, to then go on and do some other works if they had managed to get any more funding. But the urgent renovations were due to wrap up later this year or next year on this 12th century cathedral that hadn't seen any major renovation in some time, and that's why they said it really needed the work. It really had to be done very quickly. They had said that the initial repairs were urgent because it was literally falling apart with pieces of stone falling off. And at the back of the cathedral, they have what they've called the graveyard, which is where the pieces of stonework, where gargoyles, where statues are all stored that have fallen off the building.
As you point out, it was crumbling. Anybody who visited Paris could easily see that. But this has been a big point of discussion in Paris for quite some time, Elaine, about what to do about Notre Dame and how to fix it.
Absolutely. And part of the issue has been that the cathedral is, there are several organizations involved. It is part of the church, but it is also part of the city. And the French government had pledged to cover 50 million.
Sorry about that.
Euros of the cost of repairs, but the church said they needed to raise really 150 million more over 10 years, and they had been hoping to really get to work on it and fix it, which they have been doing, to get the urgent stuff out of the way. But they have said, you know, that was still only going to make sure it was just all right. The whole effort involved a lot of different people, a lot of different organizations, including France's National Monuments Body, and also appeals to private individuals, including in the U.S., hoping to get people who love Paris, who love Notre Dame of Paris, to actually give some money and help in those vital repairs. And
Elaine, talk about the cathedral living there. Talk about the cathedral itself, the structure, and what people are seeing right now, the buildings and the island itself.
Well, what they're seeing right now is just flames. We've been told that the entire structure is on fire. It's not just the roof, it is the entire church. Don't forget, as well as the wood in the structure itself, there are all the wooden pews. There is the wood involved in there are wall hangings, there are separation areas, where the choir sits, all of that is wooden. There is just so much wood in there to go on fire. There are also tapestries and artworks, and it's just highly flammable. The church itself it's a thing of beauty, or was, and people would visit. You know, it was always on people's lists of things to see in Paris because it's at the heart of the city, both geographically and emotionally. It's where people would gather. It's where people go to pray. It's where people who don't even go to pray would visit the church on Easter week or around Christmas for carol singing, for services, and it's a place that's always been very special to people, and it's known around the world, whether it's those who loved Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame, or if it's people who love architecture because of its very pure Gothic architecture. It's been such a huge part of Paris and indeed of France, and there are a lot of emotional responses and tweets out at the moment, not just from politicians and mayors and dignitaries, but from ordinary French people who can't believe that this famous landmark in Paris is crumbling away before everyone's eyes, and that spire that stands so tall, even though it's in the lowest part of the city that is a bowl, but it was visible from pretty much everywhere. And so to think that will no longer be visible, it's just tearing people apart here. It's breaking their hearts.
All right, Elaine, thank you. No one forgets the first thing, myself included, the first time they saw Notre Dame, and to see it burn is difficult to watch. Even more difficult for those on the scene, including Victoria Woodall, who's a reporter with our station in Philadelphia, KYW. Victoria, where are you, and what are you seeing from your position?
Hi, Jeff. Well, right now, I've been staying in the Latin Quarter on vacation, and we are on the balcony of an Airbnb that we're staying at. And what we're looking at right now is if we were facing the Notre Dame, we would be on the right-hand side of the bell tower, on the other side of the Seine. And I think what's so emotional right now is I can hear people in the streets singing. They're singing and praying and watching this billowing fire continue to persist, and now within the belly of the church. This has been going on for a few hours now, at least 2 hours. My husband and I, we were walking around this beautiful city, and we see this billowing of yellow, dark smoke, and we're like, what could that possibly be? We start moving more towards the direction of our area in the Latin Quarter of where we are, and we see it is the Notre Dame in flames. It looks like it started on the back end. It still has not reached those bell towers, but what we've been watching is the emergency teams trying their best to put this fire out, but the wind is also very serious, and I think that's what continues to be so disheartening because they're fighting so hard. But the wind is one obstacle that is for sure working against them. But it's extremely disheartening, Jeff. I mean, the crowds in the street, they are glued to what they're watching. The singing in the street they're songs of prayer. I don't think anyone around the world can imagine what we're seeing before us right now. It's unbelievably disheartening, Jeff. Unbelievable.
Well, we get one sense of it here watching on television, but it's a completely different one being there and hearing what you're saying about what people are doing right now. That singing on the streets, that praying, that hoping that something changes here after this awful afternoon in Paris. Tony Headley is also there. Tony, are you watching the work that firefighters are able to do right now? Let's try again. Tony Headley, are you with us?
Hi,
Okay.
I'm standing on l'île Saint-Louis, which is right across from l'île de la Cité, where Notre-Dame is still in flames. Firemen on the top of tall trucks, tall ladders, are dousing the fire, which is at the furthest eastern end of Notre-Dame, which is in the center of Paris. Thousands of people are standing by in shock. They're not making much noise. The only noise you can hear is that of the firemen's trucks and sirens arriving. I asked one of the bystanders, and he explained to me that this was the loss of a symbol, of Christianity in Europe. And although it might be rebuilt, this is what we were witnessing as we speak.
Tony, talk about the work that is. I know the entire island now has been cleared out. Does it look as though people are still leaving, and how far back are they keeping people right now?
New York, can you hear me?
Yes, Tony, we hear you. Go ahead.
New York, can you hear me?
Okay. Guys, there's some connection issues there, I think. So I'd like to go back to Elaine if we could for just a quick moment. Elaine, can
you hear me?
Yes, Tony, we hear you. Go ahead.
New York, can you hear me?
Is that SPCC?
Guys, there's some connection issues there, I think. So I'd like to go back to Elaine if we could for just a quick moment. Some connection issues. And how far back are they keeping? Tony, talk about the work that is. I know the entire island now has been cleared out. Does it look as though people are still leaving, and how far back are they keeping people right now?
New York, can you hear me?
Yes, Tony, we hear you. Go ahead.
New York, can you hear me?
Okay.
Is that SPCC?
Guys, there's some connection issues there, I think. So I'd like to go back to Elaine if we could for just a quick moment. Elaine Cobb on the scene for us as well in Paris. What else do you know, Elaine?
Jeff, the Deputy Mayor of Paris has said that Notre Dame has suffered colossal damages, and it seems that the main thrust of work of the firefighters now is to try to save any artworks that they possibly can inside the church. The whole roof, the whole main area is down. What is still standing are the two towers in the front, those twin square towers, and some of the very back of the church, which faces onto the river at the back of the Ile de la Cité. But the entire center, the top half at least, is gone, and the fire now inside the structure, and therefore hitting all of the pews, all of the wooden artworks, all of the wooden framing inside the building, because, of course, it's a very large cathedral, and it's in that traditional form with, they've got a wooden raised area surrounded by wooden panels for the choir and for the priests and for smaller services. So an awful lot of wood inside to catch fire and to spread the fire.
All right, Elaine, thank you very much. And as the sun continues to set here in Paris, it's going to create a sensational and tragic scene in the sky as the flames continue moving up into the air and as firefighters continue to do their work. To update you now on what has been happening and what you've been watching transpire here, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris has been largely destroyed today by flames that broke out during a massive renovation project. Notre Dame dates back to the 12th century. It is the most visited landmark in Paris. It is one of the most famous churches. It is one of the most famous landmarks in the world. Within the last hour, the spire of Notre Dame collapsed. The roof of Notre Dame, most of the roof of Notre Dame has collapsed. We are still watching all of these pictures come in from Paris as a spokesperson, unfortunately, from the Notre Dame Cathedral tells us everything is burning. We are going to have much more on your local news on this CBS station on this fire in Paris on our digital network CBSN, and we'll be back with a full report on what is happening in Paris this afternoon on the CBS Evening News. Until then, I'm Jeff Glor here in New York.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.
And we is headed to the scene after he postponed a televised speech to the nation because of the fire. In a tweet, he wrote his thoughts were with all Catholics and all French people. Candida Moss is on the phone with us now. She is a theology professor at the University of Birmingham in the UK. So, Candida, we're hearing from a spokesperson at the church that everything is burning, nothing will remain of the frame. Again, this frame is mostly wood, 300-year-old wood. Is that correct? I mean, I can't imagine that wood so old wouldn't just burn instantly.
That's correct. Really old wood does burn quickly, and a lot of the artwork that's inside the cathedral is very heavy. If you think of that Pietà, it's very difficult to move that out of the cathedral. And so a lot of the artwork is going to be just very difficult to remove from the site. We're really seeing 800 years of French history go up in flames.
And we have Elaine Cobb standing by as well, I believe. Elaine, what can you tell us? Is President Macron there now at the site of the cathedral?
President Macron has just arrived at the site. He is there with the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, and he's already been tweeting, saying, like all of my compatriots, I am saddened by what is happening. And other politicians saying, this is a part of our history of us that is burning tonight. People have been cleared from the Ile de la Cité, from the entire area around the cathedral. All the roads leading onto the island have been blocked off. People have been evacuated from the hospital nearby and from the courthouse, because the main courthouse is also on the Ile de la Cité.
And Candida, we understand that the Archbishop of Paris, his office is in the cathedral, or was in the cathedral at this point. Is he also there on the scene? Have we heard from the Archbishop?
We haven't heard from him yet, but we've seen a lot of activity on social media from various French Catholic organizations who obviously are as devastated as everyone else, because so much of the city has been left spiritually homeless by the fire.
Notre Dame Cathedral is also sometimes called Our Lady. And it is, of course, as we were talking earlier, still used by the Roman Catholic Church for Sunday Mass. Is it a popular spot, Candida, for Sunday Mass?
It is. It's also a kind of religious pilgrimage site for tourists who are visiting. They had just this week, for Holy Week, they had 16 services scheduled for this week to celebrate Easter. And so you can imagine that they would have expected a huge influx of tourists there to celebrate Easter in Paris, as well as just sort of local Catholics in the city. And of course, none of that can take place now.
And I would also like to bring in Mikey Kay. He is there on the scene there in Paris. He's with us on the phone. Mikey, what has changed since we last spoke? You said you saw that the fire appeared to be spreading, that it had not abated. What is the latest that you can see?
Something's starting to go down here in Paris. It's 10 to 9 local time. And all I can see now are still flames, which seem to be reaching the top of the what was the roof and the scaffolding structure that surrounded the entire roof and the structure. is barely intact, but it is intact.
Mikey, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you because we are having some audio problems, some difficulties there. We're going to fix them and get back to you. So, Candida, let me ask you a little bit more about the significance of this church throughout history. I mean, of course, we know Victor Hugo wrote his novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, that is credited with sort of reviving popular attention toward the flagging building at the time. The story of Joan of Arc is also closely related to this cathedral, is it not?
Yes, it is. There is a beautiful statue of Joan of Arc there until today, obviously. But in addition, Joan of Arc's family petitioned at Notre Dame to sort of vindicate her because, of course, she died as a martyr. She is celebrated there at the cathedral. It's the site where Napoleon was crowned emperor and also where he later was married. And even Henry VI of England was crowned King of France there during a war in the 15th century. So it's a real focal point for political events and cultural events, as well as a religious symbol and the sort of beating heart of the Catholic Church in France.
I'm glad that you brought up that history, the crowning of Henry VI, correct, of England, right inside the cathedral. I understand that it was at one point in a stage of total disrepair, close to the point of being demolished. So I guess this gives us some hope that perhaps the cathedral can recover from this fire, because it was later saved by Napoleon, who himself was crowned emperor in 1804 inside the cathedral. So I suppose it has been close to total destruction before. It was revived. Let us hope that perhaps that can happen again. I just want to mention quickly, and perhaps, Candida, you can talk more to this, about some of the precious artifacts that are inside the cathedral that I know that firefighters are working hard right now to save. You know, so many historical artifacts, among them the notable 17th century organ, with all of its parts still functional. There are drawings, plans, and engravings which showed the old and hidden parts of several of the church developments, and also that sort of show how the city of Paris itself came into being. So there's so much history inside that cathedral.
That's right. So there are many beautiful paintings from the 17th century onwards. There's a gorgeous stone Pietà. There are a number of monuments to individual bishops around the church that are absolutely gorgeous and of historic interest as well. But when you mention the sort of museum-like quality of the crypt underneath the cathedral, that's also very significant, not just in terms of documenting the history of the cathedral, but as you said, the history of all of Paris.
Now, can we assume that the stone exterior will not burn, that what is burning right now is the wooden frame on the inside, but the stone will at least remain intact?
You would think so, but of course things can be very badly damaged. Stone sculptures can be very badly damaged. In fact, it was only relatively recently, in the 60s, at the 800th anniversary of the cathedral, that the actual facade was cleaned from all of the soot that was on it. Perhaps one sort of reassuring thing is that the spire that we saw collapse was actually a renovated spire that was built in the 19th century, only bigger than the one that had been there previously. So as you mentioned, the cathedral has really come back from states of disrepair before.
So let's hope that that can happen again. I want to point out that President Trump just commented moments ago on the Notre Dame fire. He is in Burnsville, Minnesota, for a round table. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Terrible, terrible fire. You probably saw, some of you have heard, some of you have not because you've been here. But I will tell you the fire that they're having at the Notre Dame Cathedral is something like few people have witnessed. When we left, we had a whole group of your great representatives, and when we left the plane, it was burning at a level that you rarely see a fire burn. It's one of the great treasures of the world, the greatest artists in the world. Probably, if you think about it, I would say, Jovita, it might be greater than almost any museum in the world, and it's burning very badly. It looks like it's burning to the ground. So that puts a damper on what we're about to say, to be honest, because that is beyond countries, that's beyond anything. That's a part of our growing up. It's a part of our culture. It's a part of our lives. That's a truly great cathedral. And I've been there and I've seen it, and there's no cathedral. I think I could say there's probably no cathedral in the world like it. It's a terrible scene. They think it was caused by, at this moment they don't know, but they think it was caused by renovation. And I hope that's the reason. Renovation, you know, what's that all about? But it's a terrible sight to behold.
And for the latest on the fire in Notre Dame there in Paris, CBS News' Ian Lee joins us now from our London bureau. Ian, thank you for being with us. What more can you tell us about the state of the fire at this time?
Well, Tanya, right now they're really just trying to bring those flames under control. The more that fire burns, the more priceless artifacts, and really that building is at risk. We know that firefighters are also trying to rescue as much of that history as they possibly can. But we also remember they need to be doing it in a safe way. This fire is very dangerous. This is a building that's hundreds of feet high, and so you don't know what can fall down or what the stability of some of those walls are. You also just look at the stability of the entire structure. We know when that spire collapsed that it really lit a lot of inside of the cathedral on fire, and it spread the flames, and so they're going to have to be checking out to make sure it is safe for them. You have those flying buttresses that really help hold the walls up, and that integrity, those are going to have to be looked after. But right now it really is trying to bring those flames under control, make sure everyone's safe. That island has been evacuated. And we are hearing, from the French president who tweeted out, and I think this really underscores what Notre Dame means for the people of Paris and really the world, is saying that to see this is to see part of all of us burning, which just underscores what this 12th century cathedral meant to the people there. This is the most visited place in Paris, 13 million people a year, really not just a landmark of Paris, but really the world. And so what can they get out of there to save from those flames? I'm hearing that there's a number of relics in there. Let me just tell you, what we're seeing is there's pieces of the cross they believe that Jesus was crucified on, as well as part of the thorn crown that he had, as well as one of the nails from the crucifixion. These are relics that the church has at Notre Dame. Their status is unknown right now. So that is just part of all the artwork, all that history, the statues, the stained glass windows that are in there. They is known for these beautiful rose stained glass windows, meters, feet in wide, and those too at the time when they were built were amazing, and even to this day. But stained glass is very fragile, and so the likelihood that they could survive a fire is low. So really, this is how it's going to go. They're going to be looking for the structure of this building, of course, but then take stock of what was lost.
Ian, thank you for that. Joining us now is James Shepard, the Director of Preservation and Facilities at Washington National Cathedral. He can speak more, I hope, James, to some of the priceless artifacts that are there, because, James, you've led efforts to repair the cathedral in D.C. So what can you tell us about the work being done at the Notre Dame Cathedral? What state was it in before this fire began?
Well, obviously, similar to Washington National Cathedral, they were on a comprehensive restoration campaign, and they were looking at both the exterior and interior. So obviously something like this fire is just absolutely devastating to all of us who oversee heritage churches, because it's not just about what's happening up at the roof. Obviously, you can see from the live video, that Central Tower had flames that caused it to collapse. You also have to imagine, as it collapses, all of the impact that it has on the inside and the building fabric. I oversee Washington National Cathedral, both the outside envelope, but also all of the artifacts that contribute to its history on the inside. And that is so much part of its legacy as it is at Notre Dame. That's 800 years of history of people pilgrimaging there and worshiping there and the accumulation of culture. And all of that's going to have to be taken in consideration as they try to both repair this church and save it after this devastating fire.
Can you speak to some of the specific artifacts? Are you familiar with some of the more valuable or more noteworthy artifacts there?
Well, obviously, I mean, similar to Washington National Cathedral, but with a very different age. They have just some stunning and exquisite stained glass windows. Actually, some of our rose windows at the National Cathedral took some inspiration from Notre Dame. So those are just absolutely priceless artifacts. And those windows tell stories in the building fabric that were such a part of why people came to cathedrals. They were a building fabric for people who couldn't read, who came to visit these medieval cathedrals and learn from the stories that the building had to tell. And those stained glass windows are just absolutely priceless and some of the best examples of European stained glass windows. And so it will be really devastating to see them lost. Hopefully, in the midst of all this, they can sort out how to both stabilize the building and also maintain and stabilize those stained glass windows. But it is going to be difficult.
I mean, the loss of a structure of this magnitude for the people of France, actually for the people of the world, but it's really impossible to overstate. The French writer and historian Camille Pascal just said that this fire has caused, quote, the destruction of invaluable heritage, and we can only be horrified by what we see. He recalled that Notre Dame's bells sounded a death knell after the November 15th terror attacks in Paris. So this is really the heart, both literally and figuratively, of Paris, is it not?
It is. I mean, it is. Well, it's the center for history. You got to remember these medieval churches in Europe. Not only were they a place of strong center for religion, but they were also a center for culture. And people gathered here for all kinds of occasions throughout history, and that even carries through, as you mentioned, to modern day. So they take on a certain importance, and they also obviously are a major tourist destination for people around the world coming to Europe and Paris, and that's one of the major icons that they come to see as a representation of French Gothic architecture. So I think it's really a culturally devastating moment for both the city of Paris, the country, and the world.
Okay, really quickly, we're going to jump over to Mikey Kay. He is a security expert. He's there on the scene in Paris and joins us now on the phone. Mikey, as night falls there, as it gets darker, as we can see from the images coming across, can you describe the scene?
Hi, Tanya. Yeah, there are. I've been on scene now for about an hour and 15 minutes, and there are thousands and thousands of onlookers basically just aghast at what they're looking at. No one can quite sort of take in what they're seeing, and the magnitude of this moment. As the sun begins to set and night starts to take hold, you can see the glow coming from the cathedral. The flames appear not to be as bad, and I feel like the wind has dropped slightly. About an hour ago, there seemed to be a 10 to 15 knot wind, a westerly, which was really blowing the flames and the heat towards the 225 iconic towers that effectively provide the fascia of the cathedral.
We are getting a report that sorry to interrupt you, Mikey, but we're getting a report that one of those rectangular towers may have caught fire. Are you seeing that at all?
I can see the one which is effectively north-facing, because I'm at just north of Point d'Arcole. That looks fairly intact from my position. I can also see the infrastructure as you go east of the two towers. Effectively, the cathedral runs effectively east-west. As you go east towards the rear, where the 300-foot spire was, you can still see effectively the skeletal structure of the cathedral, the stone architecture, the Gothic architecture, the architecture that was so symptomatic and so reminiscent of what Notre Dame was in terms of French Gothic architecture. That still looks intact.
You can see streams of water, though, headed towards one of the towers, which makes us believe that there must be some fire there, even if it's not fully visible from where we stand.
Sure, I'm sure the internals of the tower and the components that are made of wood it wouldn't surprise me at all if they had succumbed, or part of it had succumbed, because as I was saying, the intensity of the heat and the flames coming out of the main structure that sits behind the towers, because of the westerly wind, i.e. a wind that was going in a westerly direction, it was pushing all that heat and all that flame across the towers. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if the contagion effect, that the wood components of one, if not both of those towers, wasn't severely affected.
Mikey, thank you so much. Please stick around. We'll get right back to you. But we also have CBS News correspondent Elaine Cobb on the phone with us now. Elaine, how has the French government responded to this thus far? We know that President Macron is there near the cathedral. What are you hearing, though? What is the official word on the airwaves there, on the radio? How is this being explained to the Parisians?
Well, at the moment, the Paris prosecutors have opened an investigation to see what caused the fire. That's not to suggest that it was caused maliciously, but they have to look into what exactly happened. The President, Emmanuel Macron, has already tweeted his sorrow at this loss to all of France. And he's now at Notre Dame Cathedral with the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe. We've also heard from the junior Interior Minister, who said that there were no injuries and no deaths in the fire. And UNESCO have also been tweeting about it and talking about it because, of course, it is a heritage site. And in fact, when I spoke to the spokesman for the cathedral last year about the renovation work, he said, this isn't a French monument, it's not a Parisian monument, this is a world monument because it is known worldwide, it is loved worldwide, and it is special not just for the religious significance, but for its architecture and for its artworks and for its history and its place in Paris for so long. It was built in 1163 is when it started, and it has survived the French Revolution. It survived 2 world wars. And it is heartbreaking for people here in Paris looking at it now, seeing it go up in flames when it has survived so much.
It has come back from massive destruction before. Elaine, do you know where in the cathedral the fire is believed to have begun, whether it was at the spire or elsewhere?
At this stage, we don't know. It looks like it started nearer the upper levels, near the roof, near the spire, but that's only based on the fact that that's what was ablaze so quickly and what collapsed first. But of course, those are structures with an awful lot of wood in them. So we don't know for sure at this stage. And at the moment, it looks like all that is still standing is the outer shell, particularly front and back, where you have the stone columns and stone towers. But it's the spokesman says that the whole church is on fire and that the loss will be immeasurable.
Yes, and that they don't believe any part of the frame will survive this fire. Earlier there was a firefighter's opinion who weighed in to some CBS producers about church fires and saying that they are particularly difficult because, any large church, once the fire gets to the roof, it's nearly impossible to keep the roof from burning off. They're very, very hard from a firefighter's perspective. And also, I'm wondering, with wood that old, if something as simple as, a cigarette butt could cause this kind of destruction.
It's certainly very old wood. A lot of the wood in the roof was 13th century because quite a bit of it has been there all along and has stood the test of time. Not all of it. The spire itself, in fact, was a much more recent addition, having had to be renovated before. But the main concern for the last while and why they have the renovations was more the stonework because the gargoyles, the famous gargoyles of Notre Dame, some of them had been crumbling and falling off the church. Statues have been coming down, and several of the flying buttresses have had to be shored up. and there are giant staples in the stonework up on the roof in order to keep them in place and to stop them falling on people, much more at the back of the church. But that's why the whole side of the cathedral was blocked off to people. They wouldn't normally be wandering around there because people mostly go to the front and over the gardens on the back by the river. But there were a lot of areas where they simply stopped people being able to even get near it or to see what they called the stone graveyard, which is where the statues and other pieces of stonework were kept that fell off the church, in the hope that they could be renovated and reused and put back onto the cathedral.
All right, Elaine Cobb, CBS News correspondent, we thank you. We know you have to leave us to do another hit, but I'm going to turn now to James Shepard, the Director of Preservation and Facilities at Washington National Cathedral. James, maybe you can speak to the structure of a cathedral like Notre Dame a bit. You know, we understand it's a wooden frame, inside stone structures. Does that imply that the exterior stone structures are likely to survive this fire?
Well, it's risky. It's obviously in older churches like this, the fires often start in the attic because that's where the predominant amount of the wood is. And in this case, obviously, it's 800 years worth of historic wood up there. The wood framing that shapes out the wood rests on the exterior walls. The exterior walls push out on the buttresses that then transfer the load down to the ground. So obviously, with the roof collapsing, it does leave the exterior shell unstable, and there is obviously significant risk that with the roof structure falling, depending on how severe the fire is and how it collapses, that the exterior walls may collapse inward. There is some likelihood that they will remain standing, but that's not high. The other thing that has to be overlaid with this is a lot of the buttresses at Notre Dame had iron stabilization work done over many, many years to try and rectify some of the shifting of those buttresses. And the iron work is now withstanding tremendous heat, and it's unclear as to how well that will stand up over the heat and whether those will also potentially fail.
Oh, my goodness. So you've just gone through a major preservation effort. You know, give us an example or an idea of what it might take to, I mean, obviously, we don't know the extent of the devastation yet. The fire is still burning there at Notre Dame. But from what you've seen so far, can you give us an idea of what it might take to restore this cathedral?
Well, one thing I would mention is obviously there's the devastation of the fire, the potential for collapse, but there's also the devastation of the water that's being used to put out the fire. So obviously, you're trying to correct and protect as much heritage fabric as you can, but that water is also incurring further damage to everything that's inside the cathedral. You think of the paintings, the artwork, the frescoes, the mosaics, the woodwork, all of that, if it does survive the fire, also has to survive the water that's putting on to douse the fire. So there will be some significant steps of sort of assessment after this to make sure that as much care is taken to save and extract everything that is still salvageable and make sure that it is put in the appropriate condition to conserve it. Obviously, within the immediate aftermath of an effect like this, you want to make sure that you're doing everything possible to get the remaining artifacts, surviving artifacts, out and in the right conservation conditions so that you can actually conserve and restore them as best as possible.
Would you imagine, though, that a total restoration of the cathedral is possible at this point?
I would say at this point, they are not going to have a lot left to conserve. It's a little too early to assess, obviously, but given the amount of fire that you see from the distance and how it's penetrated the inside, it's devastating. They are going to have a tough time. Hopefully, in their restoration efforts, they've had a lot of documentation done of the interior and outside of the building, which I assume they have as they plan the restoration. Those will become critical tools for them to be able to restore the church and recreate things that were lost. But even that's going to be challenging.
It's devastating to hear that, James. Thank you so much for that. Joining us now on the phone from Paris is former CBS News producer Tony Headley. Tony, can you tell us, first of all, where you are and describe what you're seeing?
I'm standing on l'Île Saint-Louis, which is right on the east of l'Île de la Cité. It's right above the Seine. I can see the nave of the church of Notre Dame, which is still being doused by two powerful hoses on top of tall ladders. And they've been doing so for the past half hour. And the person that spoke before mentioned the water. They've been dousing water from the top, and the flames are still going. The metal structure is still standing. One would expect that it would crumble at some point underneath the heat, but the flames are still going from the distance. The flames of heat are very tall. And what's rather impressive, and I've covered things like the Bataclan bombings, is the reaction of the people. People are in shock. People are very solemn. They're watching. One bystander told me that watching the symbol of Christianity in Europe burning, and it's a feeling of absolute horrific shock that everybody and all the Parisians surrounding me are feeling, I believe.
Have you seen a wave of different emotions as this, this has been going on now for almost 2 hours at this point? Have you seen the emotions move from shock to dismay to grief? I mean, has there been a series of reactions that you've witnessed?
Everybody's contemplating, and few people were crying. Most people are just remaining silent and in sort of a form of respect. Christians are not Christians. Everybody's watching the monument of Paris, and indeed, between the fire and the water, what is going to be left of the structure? The fire seems to have started underneath the metal structure where they were doing repairs, and is basically progressing down. And I can see them from my own eyes now, flames still raging above.
Wow.
How tall are they? I cannot say, but it is extremely shocking.
And we understand that the entire Ile de la Cité has now been evacuated. Is that correct?
L'Ile de la Cité is, for the moment, got only fire trucks that I can see. Nobody can get across the bridges. There's 2 bridges that I can see from where I'm standing on the Quai d'Orléans, and nobody's reaching or crossing over. The other major impact, and the way I learned about it was I switched on the radio and I heard that the president, Emmanuel Macron, had canceled a speech for a fire, and then I just the window on my balcony, and I live about 3 kilometers away, and I saw the plumes of smoke coming from the center of Paris, and raced down here to discover the symbol of Paris, Notre de Paris, burning what it seems like down to the ground.
It must have been a total shock for you, as it was to everyone, to all of us, as we saw these images, but to you especially, and those who are right there on the scene. Is there any more of a worry or a concern that the fire could move beyond the cathedral?
No, it seems very much contained within the nave of, this is what I can see from my viewpoint here on l'Île Saint-Louis, on the nave. So after the transept facing east, on the nave of the cathedral, they're dousing and trying to angle the hoses in order for the water to fall right in the middle of the nave. All of the metal structure above it for the repairs is still up, and all the stones. I haven't seen any stones falling, and people around. There's nobody around. There's a garden right behind right behind the Notre Dame Cathedral. But for instance, just now, the flames are still going up, whilst they're hosing it down with what I can see are 3 different ladder hoses, which are at the extent of their reach, and the water is angling right above the flames, sort of falling on it, but also going on the other roof.
So it's sort of impossible to see at this point exactly how this fire will end still. It's very much an active fire, correct?
It's absolutely an active fire. I've been here for over 3/4 of an hour, and nothing seems to have calmed down, except for more fire brigades and water being doused on Notre Dame. No, I don't know, but it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere fast.
We do see images of, lots of police and officials, obviously firefighters outside the church. Are they making sure that people stay far away? Are people cooperating?
People are very calm. We're used to events in the streets in Paris. We're used to bombings. We're used to terrorist attacks. And people's reactions, people are very calm and are just in shock, really, and standing by an ambulance try to pass through the crowd earlier, and everybody spread out immediately. So there is no sense of panic or sense of the fact that the fire is going to go further than the cathedral, the cathedral, the Notre Dame de Paris, which is very much isolated from the other buildings around it.
Right. No, it's shocking to the soul of a city to see such an iconic structure like the Cathedral of Notre Dame destroyed. I would imagine that the city, and maybe you can speak to this, will galvanize after this and do whatever it takes to rebuild it. Do you think that would be the case?
It was the case where there was the first terrorist attack at the Charlie Hebdo, the satirical newspaper. Everybody gathered and wore a T-shirt saying "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie. Mm-hmm. It was the same after attacks at the Bataclan, which killed over 100 people. It's a city that might be feisty and might go down the streets and shout for its rights and seen it with the Yellow Jackets. There's been quite a bit of confrontation, but they very much come together when something so dramatic as this is happening.
And no doubt the Yellow Jackets are laying low this evening. Is that right, Tony?
Oh, nobody's going to be seen with the yellow jacket.
Yeah,
I'm sure of that.
I am sure. Are you seeing great sadness on the streets, or mostly shock, like you said, and just sort of numbness?
Sullenness. Mm-hmm. The shock and sort of disbelief is a few tears. People remain very dignified. A few tears, and people are standing around. They're not going. The quays of the Seine are just stacked with people. There's over a few thousand people just from my vantage point at Quai d'Orléans. And police are patrolling, the firemen patrolling in a boat on the Seine, just to make sure that nobody falls in, I suppose. But
right.
Everybody's just standing here.
Oh my goodness. Well, Tony, thank you so much. We're gonna check in again with Candida Moss. She is on the phone with us. She's a theology professor at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Candida, how can we imagine that Holy Week there in Paris will be impacted by this?
Well, it's going to be a period of mourning. It's going to be a period of grief. And part of Holy Week always has that element. It always has an element of sadness in it. But that's going to be amplified this year because of what's happened at Notre Dame. And for so many of Paris's Catholics and visiting tourist pilgrims, they are going to have to find somewhere else to go, whether it's Sacré-Cœur or one of the many other less famous churches in Paris, because for many people, this was going to be their spiritual home this week, and that's no longer going to be possible.
And can we imagine that whoever is part of that congregation there at the Cathédrale de Notre Dame will be warmly welcome at any other church in Paris this week?
Yes, of course. I think it's going to give a heightened poignancy to Holy Week this year. Of course, people will be welcome at other churches, but we might even see sort of public religious displays, veneration at the site once the flames come down. There could be services held outdoors, for example, but so far we've seen sort of minimal response from the Catholic Church. I haven't actually seen a Vatican statement yet about this, and the Twitter feed of the Archbishop of Paris has been silent. Now, he doesn't tweet a lot, but you would expect more responses from within the church itself.
Yes, I was just going to ask you about that, whether we'd heard anything from the Archbishop of Paris or I believe the Cathédrale de Notre Dame has its own Twitter feed as well. I don't think I've seen anything there. It's easy to understand they are otherwise occupied at the moment, but still a lot of people hoping for news. Looking at these pictures, we're looking at some pictures earlier because you can tell that it's not as dark. You can see already how the famous rose window, even earlier in the evening there, has been affected by the smoke. Is anything likely to survive in terms of the beautiful stained glass?
It's likely that the stained glass is going to be damaged beyond repair. Of course, these things are documented and can be recreated. And I think people will ask questions after this. It was very difficult for people to raise funds for the renovations, which were really sort of the bare minimum that could be done. And part of the reason for that is just flagging church attendance in France. There just isn't the same life and energy to the Catholic Church in France that there once was. And so they were looking to international donors, including donors from the United States. And so I think people will be asking questions about the obligations of the church and the public to restoring the site, as well as the obligations of the country of France and its government to sort of maintain a site that has great religious significance, but also great cultural significance.
Exactly. Indeed, Candida. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to CBS News radio correspondent Bill Rakoff, who joins us on the phone. He's been a volunteer firefighter for the past 30 years. Bill, can you give us some insight into what these firefighters are up against and how a fire like this is particularly difficult to fight?
Well, I'll tell you, Tanya, church fires in general are really hard to fight, whether it's a smaller church with a big nave in it, or if it's something to this level of a cathedral. And it almost seems as if, and I'm not there, but just looking at it, as if the die was probably cast by the time firefighters arrived. I mean, that fire was high up on the roof. It presented a logistical challenge. The cathedral itself sits on an island in the middle of the Seine River. It may have been difficult to get apparatus into position, particularly the aerial pieces that need to put water on that fire up on top. You could try to go inside and do something with it, but with all of the flammable material inside a church and with those old timbers that build up and comprise the trusses of the roof, they go up like tinder, and you don't want to put your people in the road of anything that might collapse. So it was one of those situations where perhaps you get into the situation, you right off the roof and hope you can save what's inside.
We've been following this fire since the earliest images were coming across, and it appeared from what we could see that the fire started pretty high up. It was either on the roof or on the spire. What does that tell you?
Well, I mean, that's where we first saw it. So we don't know exactly where the fire started. It's still possible it might have started inside the building and vetted its way outside, or, it may have been the construction materials on the roof. It may have just been a coincidence. Right now, we don't know, and the investigators are going to look very, very closely at that once they get everything under control and are able to interview the people who were there and around the scene. But yes, the fact that the fire started way up high makes it so hard. The other factor here was the wind. If you saw those earlier pictures, where that fire started, near that old beautiful spire, the wind was pushing toward the front of the cathedral, and it was a heavy wind. You could see that from the column of smoke that was just being pushed toward the front. That was also bad news for firefighters, because instead of burning toward the back, where they might have been able to contain it and try to keep the front of the building secure, the wind pushed that fire along the roof line up to the iconic bell towers.
Now, in your experience as a firefighter, when you're talking about wood this old, 300-year-old wood, could something, as insignificant as a tossed cigarette be able to cause damage like this?
Oh, certainly. And whether it's somebody working on a roof or somebody outside of their house, casually throwing a cigarette into a potted plant next to vinyl siding, which is like liquid gasoline when it catches fire, from the smallest of sparks. And we've seen this with the wildfires out west. You can see such devastation. And that's why, firefighters are always preaching prevention and awareness about where you're doing things. So, again, we don't know if a smoking or the construction materials or maybe an electrical problem played a role. These are all things we're going to find out in the days and weeks to come. But, firefighters really had their hands full when they got here today. And certainly this is one that they'll go back and they'll talk about for the rest of their careers.
Yeah, I would imagine. And when you're looking at these pictures, I don't know if you're seeing the same live images that we are. What does it tell you? How far does this fire look from being put out?
So it looks like now, and from what we're being told by officials, is that the entire roof structure between where the spire stood and the bell towers has collapsed into the cathedral itself. And that's, one of the worst case scenarios, because now you've got the fire and you've got the timbers and you've got the wreckage down into the nave of the building, and that's where all of the artifacts and the works of art are that people are so concerned about, and justifiably so. And firefighters are going to be mindful of that. If there was an opportunity to get in and try to rescue some of those, they would most certainly do it. But you're also talking about large statues. You're talking about huge religious artifacts that would have been impossible to remove. So even if they were able to get some of that stuff out, you look at the picture like this and see now the fire is burning deep in. It almost looks like it's a giant fire pit at this point. You don't see the visible flame. It's all down inside the building, burning the debris that's down in there. And I'm just afraid that the losses are just going to be tragic.
Oh, and it would be far too difficult or dangerous to send, firefighters into that situation, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I recall in my hometown in the city of Pittsburgh a few years ago, they had a large church with a bell tower catch on fire, and much the same way, the roof burned off. It went down into the floor and into the basement of the building. And as firefighters were operating around the outside, one thing you have to take into account now is the integrity of the structure of those stone walls. The stone's not going to build, but don't forget, you don't have the trusses holding them together anymore. They may have been weakened by the heat, some of the seams. And what happened in Pittsburgh was there was a giant collapse of the bell tower, and tragically, 2 firefighters were killed. So even though that fire's down in the pit right now, firefighters are going to keep their distance. They're going to keep a safe perimeter. They want to watch those bell towers carefully and also those large historic stone walls to make sure that they're not in a collapse zone.
So you're saying that those stone walls could very well, by the time all is said and done, they could very well collapse?
They could. It's a concern, but we've seen other pictures, and I mean, think about the school books you looked at of some of the great cathedrals and churches that burned during World War II and were left to be shells, not just in Britain but across Europe. That's likely what we're going to see here. Is you're going to see, and again, because they're stone, they retain heat, so it turns that into a large, in effect, a Dutch oven inside there, and we'll keep the heat and we'll keep the fire going. But there are potentials for areas of those walls to have been weakened, and I'm not talking about necessarily a complete collapse, but you have to watch out for pieces of those walls, and even if it's just a small piece with that stone, it could be deadly.
Bill Rakoff, CBS News radio correspondent and volunteer firefighter for the past 30 years. We thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you, Tanya.
We are going to turn now to CBS News correspondent Elaine Cobb. She is on the phone with us from Paris. Elaine, can you give us an update on the latest of what's happening there? Has President Macron said anything more recently?
Well, President Macron was down at the church with the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe. He's already tweeted out that it was a terrible fire and a great loss to everyone. He cancelled an address to the nation that he had been due to give this evening in order to go to Notre Dame. Police officers there are saying that everything is collapsing, and a spokesman for the cathedral says the fire has taken hold of the entire structure and is burning solidly. I'm looking at pictures where it is still continuing to burn. And there is so much wood inside the church as well that it will keep the fire going. And of course, because of the stone structure, the towers are still intact, but the fire is still raging inside.
And so firefighters have not at this point given any estimate as to how long the fire may continue to rage.
No, they haven't. That's not something they would be able to predict at this stage, given the age of the building and given how the fire seems to have started, or at least first taken hold of the roof, which is, if you will, in the center of the building. So what is surviving at this stage are the towers in the front and columns and the area at the back of the cathedral. Of course, that entire area has now been evacuated. The island has been evacuated, and roads onto the Ile de la Cité have been closed. People are being kept very far back out of fear of any other very nearby buildings catching fire.
Right.
A lot of people still in the area watching the flames there.
So, Elaine, there are several people, obviously, who live on the Ile de la Cité. They will not be returning to their homes this evening. Is there any sense as to where these displaced people are headed?
An area has has been opened up for them. A building has been put at their disposition. They will be housed temporarily while they have been kept away from their homes. The city is looking after them, and they have all been informed that they cannot go home tonight. There's also a hospital just beside the church. That, too, has been evacuated. Patients taken to other hospitals in the city, and people being told to just stay away from the entire area, also in an attempt to not hamper the work by firefighters who are still trying to get some control of the flames and to save artworks that are in the church, because, of course, Notre Dame Cathedral is home to many famous and priceless art treasures.
Absolutely. And Elaine, is there any more concern at this point that the fire could spread beyond the cathedral, or does it seem to be more or less contained within the cathedral now?
It seems to be contained, but it's too soon to say because the fire is still raging, and if it takes control of the towers to the street side, away from the river on the north side, if it were to catch more there, it is not impossible that the fire could skip across the road. Now, the fire services are obviously doing everything they can to ensure that does not happen, but that is why they have evacuated everybody. Along that street to the side of the cathedral, there are lots of restaurants and cafes and fast food cafes who would all have highly inflammable, highly explosive cooking materials, oils, and equipment. And so the firefighters would be very concerned about any sparks even flashing across the road there.
Absolutely. And Elaine, it is now, what, 9:30 in Paris? Can you give us a sense of what is the mood in the city right now as people are moving to their homes, presumably either going out to dinner or children going to bed? What is the mood there in Paris?
Oh, people are in shock here. There's still a huge crowd on the neighboring Ile de la Cité and even farther up in Saint-Michel in the Latin Quarter, people who can get a view down. And people tweeting photos and their shock and their sadness at what has happened. Notre Dame is such an important part of the city. It's such a well-known monument, not just to Parisians or to the French, but around the world. And there are so many people everywhere just tweeting their disbelief, their shock. I've been receiving messages from friends around the world saying, I can't believe it. How can it be gone?
Right. It does seem absolutely unbelievable. It is really hard to fathom. Elaine, thank you so much. We will be checking in with you a little bit later. Right now, we're going to swing over to the BBC coverage coming live from Paris.
That is being reported by Reuters. A spokesman saying that this is an absolutely crucial 90 minutes ahead. Obviously, there's all huge level of damage there. The stone structure can crack. We know that the windows, of course, potentially damaged. We know that the rose window, of course, also damaged already. The spire has collapsed. Part of the roof has collapsed also. Well, we're joined by another eyewitness in Paris now, Annie Shipton, who lives in Paris and saw the early stages of the fire. Annie, what did you see? Where were you?
Well, I just finished work and I was coming round past Hotel de Ville and I saw the spire alight at the back of the church. Well, initially I thought it was another building and there were a lot of policemen around, fire engines, and it could have been anything up until the point I saw the smoke. And then I realised that it was actually Notre Dame, and then from then on, just a crowd gathered and everyone was just watching it burn. It was horrible, really, because no one could do anything. Everyone was so powerless. And the spire, which was initially visible, suddenly just got engulfed in flames, and then that took into the centre of the building. And then the spire collapsed, and the centre gradually caught light, and it just progressed towards the two towers at the front.
And where are you now? Are you still in the area?
I'm quite close, but I've actually walked back towards where I live.
And can you see, indeed, whether one of those two towers is indeed in flames?
I can't confirm that now, but it certainly looks like all of the fire was heading in that direction. And there's still crowds of people gathered there. I wouldn't be surprised if one of those two towers is alight now.
And did you see or hear anything when this started? Because reports that obviously there were workmen with this restoration going on, there was scaffolding in that area, on that part of the building where the flames started, where the smoke initially, as you said, started. We saw those images coming in. But did you see or hear anything when this all began?
No one knew what was going on. I mean, even I was one of the first people to find out, and people at my office gradually found out just by seeing it from the roof what was happening. And I think it could have been anything up until the point that it was quite obviously completely ablaze. And mainly it was the tourists. It looked like there was some kind of event going on. People were just crowded round, and then all the roads became blocked off. I don't think people were really aware of what's going on until they saw the massive flames.
The Vatican, just to let you know, for those watching, the Vatican has put out a statement, said that this fire is incredible and, of course, very sad. This is a historic monument, a Catholic cathedral, but loved by people, Christian and others, who just marvel at the beauty, who marvel at the architecture. What are the people around you that you live and work with saying, Annie Shipton? Because, obviously, for those who live in Paris, it must be incredibly distressing to see this.
They're all horrified. I mean, you can just tell by everyone who's watching it, everyone I've spoken to, no one really knows what to do. They're all worrying about whether it could be restored, how the fire can be stopped. I think it's really symbolic of this building sort of being destroyed in front of them and having no power to do anything about it, I think.
Are you surprised that perhaps helicopters weren't brought in, or that there wasn't a faster, more obvious, huge response from the emergency services? Obviously, we don't know, how quickly they got there and what they were doing. Obviously, a very, very difficult situation for them.
I think there was definitely a sense of frustration among the other people in the crowd. I mean, I was just hearing what people were saying about the reaction towards it, and it was only towards the end of the time when I was stood there watching that helicopters started to arrive. They seemed to be there more for filming than actually trying to stop the fire.
Just describe, someone who lives and works in Paris, how is Notre Dame regarded there now?
Well, I think it's incredibly important. It's the same as if one of our big symbolic buildings, I mean, I don't know, I can think of Big Ben or something like that, just catching fire. I can't imagine what it's like for the people who I walk past it most days to get to work. And so the idea of that suddenly not being there or being burnt to a husk is quite, I don't know, life-changing in a way, I guess.
And in terms of any potential cause, is the sense there that this is accidental from everything that you've seen and heard and people you've spoken to?
Yeah, from everything I've heard, it's linked to the construction work that was being done on the back of the building. That's what caught fire, and that's what people seem to think might have started the fire, that some accident happened there. I haven't heard any other reason for it to have started.
And when you were in the area, was it clear that the public was being moved back? Because obviously we heard, some concern that if there's falling debris, then people in the area also could be at risk. We don't know, of course, whether anyone inside the building was involved. We've not heard of any reports of injuries as yet, we should say.
I definitely think there was some issues with crowd control. I didn't really see, because I wasn't close enough for people being moved away from the building, but everyone watching it, I mean, were just gathering towards it, walking towards it. People were in the street, people in the road, people were taking photos in the road, cars couldn't go past, the police were having a really hard time, and the firemen for that matter, just controlling people and cars around the area as well, let alone protecting them from the building itself.
Okay,
I think everyone was just rushing towards it.
I'm sure. Annie Shipton, thank you very much indeed. We're still watching these pictures of Notre Dame Cathedral, this iconic, amazing Gothic monument in Paris, still in flames, firefighters struggling to contain it. The Vatican has said that Notre Dame, the fire has caused shock and sadness, says that it is close to French Catholics and it is praying for the firefighters. The Archbishop of Paris has called on all priests in Paris to ring the bells as a mark of gesture for Notre Dame Cathedral. And we can see, of course, those firefighters trying to reach the flames with the water cannon. We've heard that they're connected right to the Seine, the river, which is right by Notre Dame. This famous, iconic French landmark beloved by people throughout the country, throughout the world, stands, of course, on the bridges, just by the bridges overlooking the Seine. Its size makes it stand out on the Paris skyline. The French President Emmanuel Macron has rushed to the scene, cancelling a huge speech that he was due to be giving, a live speech after weeks, of course, of political difficulty in France with the Yellow Vest protests. And he has rushed there. He initially tweeted of his sadness at seeing what he described as part of us burn. The first reports of this fire surfaced nearly 3 hours ago now, and within minutes we saw smoke, and then the blaze had spread across the roof of Notre Dame. The main spire collapsed, and the cathedral spokesman have said that the roof was on fire, and of course these were the earlier pictures in the day as that fire took hold and the steeple falls there in front of you. Absolutely tragic, because that is hundreds of years of art and architecture beloved by so many. The workmanship, the craftsmanship, the beauty of that building, famed throughout the world and loved by so many. It drew so many tourists from right around the world to Paris. It is literally point zero for France. It's the centre, literally, of France, where all the roads are measured from. And we've heard messages of support and of shared heartbreak, really, from leaders right around the world, from Hillary Clinton, from Donald Trump, from the British Prime Minister, from Mrs. Merkel in Germany, from many others. Obviously, everyone desperate to try and help. There will be a huge focus on what can be restored, what restoration can be done, because that spire had been built relatively recently, some hope of plans for it potentially to be rebuilt. But before anyone gets to talk of real restoration, the first aim, of course, is to put out the fire. There have not been any reports as yet, I should say, of casualties, but the cathedral was still open. It was early evening in France, in Paris. It's always phenomenally busy there, with people queuing in front of the cathedral, queuing to get in. And these were the fire pictures from earlier, as that steeple falls there to the right of the screen, as you can just see it toppling. And that is absolutely devastating. Images coming in to us from Paris earlier, with the smoke coming out of the wooden roof. The question, of course, what damage also now to the inside, whether people inside who were put at any risk, and it is just too early to say as yet, but we have not been told of any casualties at this point. Well, the BBC's Fergal Keane has been on the banks of the River Seine, and a short time ago he sent this update.
Fire crews from across Paris have come here to save whatever they possibly can. And the striking thing, standing among the crowds on the banks of the Seine, is just the silence, the quiet of people stunned by the destruction of not just a great French cultural artefact, but of one that belonged to the world.
Well, we can talk now to our religion editor, Martin Bashir. Martin, just first, I mean, this is an iconic Catholic cathedral. This is Easter week, but this building is loved by people right around the world.
It is. It's a World Heritage Site, as you've been saying. I think the interesting thing about the cultural status of Notre Dame is that its only major rival on the skyline is the Eiffel Tower. And that's been there for barely 100 years. This building's been there for 1,200 years. But it's also true to say that France is a secular culture and society. In 1905, the French passed a law on the separation of church and state, which prohibited the state from recognising or founding any religion, and led to the barring of religious symbols in schools and public institutions. It also led to the closure of most church-run schools. And it's interesting that when President Macron expressed his own sadness, he said that his thoughts are with all Catholics and all French people, acknowledging at the same time the history of the nation, but also the present status. In terms of the Catholic Church itself, estimates range somewhere between 41 and 88% of the nation describing themselves as Catholics. The church is organised into about 98 dioceses, and in 2012, these dioceses were being served by 7,000 priests above the age of 75. Well, the church currently ordains around 80 or 90 priests a year and needs about 8 times that number to compensate for the number who pass away. But as you say, it is a World Heritage Site. It attracts millions of people every year. And of course, this week being Holy Week, we've just had Palm Sunday yesterday, and we're moving through the week, as you know, through Stations of the Cross on Thursday, Maundy Thursday. And of course, Catholics would have expected to attend church on Good Friday to mark the death of Christ, and then on Easter Sunday, his resurrection. Of course, that now imperilled by what's happened to the building.
We're just hearing that saving Notre Dame is not certain, according to the French Deputy Interior Minister on Reuters news agency. So saving the building itself, obviously, that is key at the moment. And we've seen firefighters, you can still see the water jets trying to get inside the building because it seems as though flames are inside one of the bell towers. I've just seen Notre Dame just a few weeks ago. We were in Paris with our family.
Oh, were you?
And crowds of people still from all around the world queuing up to get inside.
Sure.
How does this building manage to be iconic for people, you know, from the other side of the continent, but also maintain its spiritual character? What is its significance in the Catholic Church?
Well, in part, it's its age. And of course, for a period, the papacy was split between Rome and France, and there was the Avignon papacy. But I think that the building itself, principally because of its age, is what makes it such an attractive place to visit. When you visited, I'm assuming you went inside and saw the magnificent front-facing window and the spire and everything else in it. But it is also a functioning church where people worship. So, yes, and to your point, particularly poignant during Holy Week that this should be damaged to the extent that it has been.
And of course, there are all those treasures inside that we heard from the authorities they are trying to save, but not clear as yet, you know, whether they were able to get access quickly enough. We've heard messages of support from the Vatican. You know, how big a loss is this potentially to the Catholic community in France, first of all? How big is the Catholic community in France?
It's absolutely devastating. You ask about the size of the Catholic community. It's somewhat complicated. When people are asked what their religious position is, across statistics over the last 15 years, the number's been anything between 40 and 80% of people self-describing as Catholics. I think the vast majority suggested in, I think it was Paris Match 2 years ago, they said that most French people are Catholic atheists. That is a combination of that status. But certainly it's very different to Britain. Of course, in this country we have a monarch who's the supreme governor of the church. We have bishops who sit in the House of Lords. We have major ceremonies that take place in our religious institutions. But since 1905, with this separation of church and state, France has established itself as a secular state. I was reading one thing before I came on air, which said, you know, is this in some way a condemnation for that? You'll remember the fire, I think it was in Durham Cathedral, when the bishop up there had said certain things about the veracity of the New Testament, and then there was the fire that struck. So that was a similar thought. But no, I mean, it's obviously utterly devastating.
How many plans would there have been in terms of trying to restore this building? As we've heard, you know, it's not clear how much of this is going to be intact when the flames are finally put out. But
I'm afraid I'm not the best person to answer that question.
But you would expect a monument of this age, of this beauty, of this historic importance, to have a plan and a...
Well, what we do know is that last year the Catholic Church sent out an appeal for funds because they were looking for money to help support the cathedral. And it's also the case, it certainly appears to be the case, that there must have been some kind of emergency plan that applied to a building like this. But I'm afraid I don't have any answers on that.
OK, Martin, just stay with us for a moment. I just want to read out as well something from Anne Le Breton, a Deputy Mayor of the Le Marais district of Paris, who's told us that she arrived in time to see the spire fall. just started coming in flames. It literally just flamed up in 15 minutes. And she said everybody's running to see it and everybody's crying and everybody is so sad. Well, let's speak to Olivia Johnson, who lives in Paris and witnessed that fire also. Olivia, just tell us what you saw. Where were you?
Yeah, so maybe less than an hour after the flames started, I ran to see. I live about less than a mile from Notre Dame, and there were already crowds gathering as the first flames kind of showed themselves. And the scene was, people were quiet and sad, and just felt like nothing could be done.
And were you forced to move away? What was the response on the ground?
I was forced to move away, yes. I stood there for about 5 minutes, and then ashes and hot embers actually were falling down on the crowd, and so the police were forcing people back.
What were your thoughts as you saw this?
I'm devastated. I'm standing here watching it from the backside now, and I walk past this building almost weekly, and it's so beautiful and such a bright spot in my day, and so it's devastating for me, who's not even French, to see this happening.
Did you have any idea, as you saw this starting, how it could have started? Was there any indication, any sound, any particular smell, and any clue at all?
I'm not quite sure. I know that there have been reports of issues with the construction and the scaffolding that's been up there for a while. But yeah, all I saw was just a giant plume of kind of green-yellow smoke rising from the building for a really long time.
And so where are you standing now? What can you see at the moment?
I'm on the left bank of the Seine. I'm facing west, but I'm looking at the backside, the famous flying buttresses of the building. And I can still see flames pretty much right behind the two towers in the front and in the central part of the building. Still see flames rising up, and yeah, there are firefighters all around it trying to fight the fire, and still sirens going off every couple seconds. And just the Seine is lined with hundreds and thousands of people. It is crazy. I've never seen Paris this packed.
And how are people reacting? And you're saying just that it looks as though there are flames inside both towers. Is that what you're saying?
Behind the two towers, I can't see quite if it's in the towers. I sure hope not. But yeah, right in the middle of the building.
Okay. Annie Shipton, thank you very much indeed. We can speak now to another eyewitness there. Britain Izin Akbatu, who was inside the cathedral. Izin, where were you when this fire happened?
Okay, so basically, my mum and my sister are visiting me here in Paris. I'm on my year abroad, and we were inside the cathedral at Notre Dame at around 6:30, and a kind of alarm went off and an announcement saying that we should leave the building for our security. So the Notre Dame usually finishes at 6:45, so I assumed that maybe it was overcrowding or tourists had got too loud because the mass was still on, but obviously it was the fire.
Did you see the fire or see the smoke or smell anything?
When I was outside, yes, but not while I was inside. When we were inside and we were asked to evacuate, I actually couldn't see any sign of fire or anything like that. It wasn't until I was outside.
And what could you see when you were outside?
Well, as we were getting further and further away, we saw smoke rising, but it was a strange kind of colour. It had maybe a greeny or a yellowish kind of colouring to it, which we thought was quite strange.
And where was that coming from?
It was coming from the building. Sorry, there's just a beeping sound on the line.
And was there anything else that you could see? How fast did it spread, the flames?
We couldn't really see how fast it could spread because we got quite far away from it quite quickly. We could see kind of a lot of ambulances and such in the area, so we just didn't want to really be in the way of the people that were trying to respond on the scene.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for explaining that, Izzy. Just to let you know that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has tweeted, "Tonight we pray for the firefighters tackling the tragic Notre Dame fire for everyone in France and beyond who watches and weeps for this beautiful sacred place where millions have met with Jesus Christ. Nous sommes avec vous. Martin Bashir, your final thoughts this hour?
Well, my final thoughts relate to the fact that this is the...
Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. You have been listening to the BBC. It is 4 o'clock on the East Coast here. We continue to follow the breaking news out of Paris. Here's what we know so far. A massive fire is burning through the famous Notre Dame Cathedral in the heart of the city. The fire broke out this afternoon. The main spire of the Gothic cathedral and the roof have already collapsed. A Notre Dame spokesman says the whole frame of the cathedral is burning. Crews are trying to salvage artwork and historical pieces from inside the structure. A major operation to tackle the blaze is underway at the 850-year-old Gothic building. Paris police say the cause of the fire is not yet clear, but local media report it could be linked to renovations that were taking place there. The area immediately surrounding the church is being evacuated, but thankfully there are no reported deaths so far. French President Emmanuel Macron rushed to the scene to meet with senior officials after postponing a televised speech to the nation because of the fire. In a tweet, he wrote his thoughts were with, quote, all Catholics and all French people. Here is a look at tomorrow's front cover for Libération, a daily newspaper in France. It simply says Notre Dame, with the image of the spire collapsing. Christophe Girard is the deputy mayor of Paris in charge of culture. He joins us now by phone. Christophe, thank you so much for being with us on what must be a devastating evening for all of Paris. Can you please put this tragedy into some perspective for us?
Well, it's 10 p.m. in Paris, and, it started exactly 3 hours ago. So very long 3 hours. And of course, it's a tragedy, but not only for Paris. It's a tragedy for the world, because Notre Dame, so well described by Victor Hugo, is actually a jewel belonging to everyone on this planet. So we feel, and our mayor receiving so many messages from all around the world, from many mayors from America, from Europe, from Africa, from Asia. Everybody's just so concerned, so sad. But, our main concern right now is, of course, to let the fire forces, be able to stop and contain the fire, and that the people who live around, because there are many people who live around, we have the hospital Hotel Dieu, we have administrations, we have families, and we have to take care of them and make sure they will be able to sleep home or somewhere tonight. So we are begging, actually, tourists and Parisians not to be too close, to make the snapshot of their life, because the danger still exists, and we have to let the fire forces and the police department work in good conditions.
Yeah.
And, of course, we are in a crisis condition now, and at the City Hall, and from the City Hall, since 7 p.m., we could watch the progression of the fire, of the flames, and the cathedral, falling apart. Oh. So you can imagine just such a tragedy.
Heartbreaking. And Christophe, do we know at this point how the fire started?
Well, no, it's too early to actually say what happened. But what we know, and discussing with the bishop early tonight, what was said was there is construction work going on, but it's absolutely too early to know. So we have to let the police and the firemen do their work, and it's absolutely too early. Everything has to be put in question and be conditional.
And again, it's probably too early to answer my next question, but do you have any sense whether any of the artwork or artifacts inside have been saved?
Well, the Ministry of Culture and our services and the Louvre department have been cooperating to make sure that everything that can be saved and moved has been moved. We have been sending trucks from the City Department of Transportation, and the collaboration between the state and between the city of Paris is very, very close and very tight tonight.
Sure.
So
And
things are being under control.
so some things have been taken out of the church then? Some things have been rescued?
Yes. Some paintings, and yes, there have been elements, being taken away, because when it started at 7, it started at the roof. So there was, the reaction of the bishop team and I would say the administration, of course, to react, to protect, the values they could take out. So they did.
Well, that's good to hear, because we didn't know whether anything at all had been saved from the church. So that is wonderful to hear that at least some things.
There are many things being saved and transported by our services and the state services.
And then what is the latest that you were hearing from the Paris Fire Brigade about the status of the fire? Have they been able to put any timeline on it, or is that also an unknown at this point?
It's absolutely unknown, and we have to be extremely careful in words.
Of course, of course. Now, this cathedral is not only iconic to Paris, it is iconic to the world. 12 million tourists come every year to come and visit the cathedral. What sort of impact to tourism can you imagine this fire will have to Paris and to France?
Well, the feeling I have, there will be a lot of solidarity, because the cathedral actually belongs to the world. And we have been receiving through social networks already some proposals of supporting, and it's very moving, because everybody feels like it's their own.
Yes.
And the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, and the President Macron, they were together there, and I think they want to join the efforts. And actually, we will ask, I'm sure, for an international campaign to support, the repair, because what we have to have in mind, once the fire is over, once we are sure every citizen, every Parisian is safe and every tourist is safe, that Paris has always rebuilt whatever has been destroyed by people or by fire or by accident. So the future will be with us, and Notre Dame will live.
I'm so happy to hear you say that. So plans are sort of already underway to rebuild the cathedral. Then are there very specific, notes and plans that still exist that would allow the cathedral to be more or less reconstructed as it once stood?
The wonderful historians, architects, and specialists of landmark treasures, and they will, of course, meet and exchange, and I'm sure, within the coming weeks, we will absolutely restart, and there will be a very positive attitude to save this beloved, jewel of the world. And thank you so much for actually, being able to support this through the waves and through radio and the media.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the world will be supporting your rebuilding efforts. Can you talk a little bit about the impact on the Catholic community that this fire will have, especially since we are in the middle of Holy Week?
Well, you're right. It's Easter holiday, and the Catholic community is, of course, very attached to Notre Dame Cathedral. Catholics come from all around the world to visit Notre Dame and to pray. So tonight, the message also of our mayor, Mrs. Hidalgo, was to be close to the community, the Catholic community, as she went right away to be with the bishop, Monseigneur Chauvet, to be with him. He was, when I had him on the phone, he was crying, and like a child and like a person lost, seeing his cathedral, like you said, was in fire. He said it's just not believable. So, of course, our thoughts go to our Catholic friends.
Of course. And, Christophe, do you think that the Yellow Vest protests will pause this weekend?
Well, it's always difficult in a democracy, to make connection between demonstration. President Macron was supposed to speak tonight on television, and he had to cancel. So there will be a national, of course, moment, with Paris and with the nations in Europe, I hope, to actually pay tribute and be maybe a bit silent, with this big tragedy. But it's very hard to say because, social democracy is always alive.
Of course, of course. Can you speak to us a bit about the efforts of the firefighters? I know that they have to be particularly careful. Not only, are they trying to put out this terrible fire, but they're trying to do as little damage to the structure and the artifacts inside as they do it. Are there particular methods that they are using?
Well, as you know, we have been through sometimes sad experiences, and in the past, with what happened at the Bataclan and what happened at, in different situations. So the firemen we have, they are extremely competent, and our heroes, the way they're so professional and the way they actually got organized under the authority of our general of the firemen is just, could you excuse me 1 second? Sorry.
No problem. You are the deputy mayor of Paris. This is a very busy night for you. We definitely appreciate your time. Christophe, we're going to let you go because we know you have a lot of things to do this evening.
I'm sorry, I had to react because I'm actually, out of the crisis office, and I was outside, and there were some people moving next to me. So.
Oh, of course. Well, then, if you have a moment, I just have one last question for you. We understand that the Ile de la Cité...
Sure, no, go ahead.
We understand that the Ile de la Cité has been totally evacuated. How many, more or less, residents live on the Ile de la Cité, and where will they be staying this evening?
Well, we have decided with Mayor Hidalgo to open local city halls and sports facilities in case, they would like not to stay home, or if they're not able to join their houses. It's a question of about, 1,000, 2,000 people concerned. But also we have contacted the hotels around Ile de la Cité and Ile Saint-Louis and the center of Paris. So I think everybody is actually cooperating. So there will be a roof and a bed for everyone tonight.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. And finally, I have a question. We understand that Parisian prosecutors are also looking into the fire. Do you have a sense that there could be some charges brought against someone or any entity?
As always, when you have such a huge tragedy and such a big fire on a landmark monument, of course, all questions are being asked. So we have to let, especially when there is some construction work going on. So we have absolutely to let the police and the scientific police work to find the elements. But we need time.
Of course. Now, I know that we don't yet know how the fire started, but do firefighters know where in the church the fire originated?
It started from what we saw because we were in the meeting. When it started in the roof.
In the roof. And that is near...
That's where we saw.
And that is near scaffolding.
Where it looks like where the statues were taken down. Because last week I was with the bishop when the day they were taking the statues down, from the roof. So it looks like it started there. But, I don't know really precisely.
Of course, the investigation continues. Well, Christophe Girard, we appreciate your time so much. We know that this is a, devastating evening for you and for all of Paris, but the world is with you. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for doing this interview. It's very important because, we love all English-speaking people to come a lot.
Oh, yes.
And, we don't like Brexit. We don't like Brexit too much.
Well, we're here in America, so it doesn't really affect us one way or the other.
I know, but, English citizens are our cousins, too.
Absolutely.
I know we're in America.
No, I know.
Great America.
I'm teasing you. And, so many people have visited, obviously, Notre Dame. And I have to say, on a personal note, I was engaged in that beautiful church. So it means something to me personally very much as well.
Oh, my God. So, yes, of course. Well,
yes.
We would build it for you.
Yeah. Well, for the world. Christophe Girard, we thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you, and good night, America.
Now, CBS News correspondent Imti Tayyab is tracking the fire from London and joins us. Imtiaz, what more can you tell us? What have you learned at this point?
Hi, Tanya. Good to be with you. Agonizing images out of Paris as this historic monument, this 850-year-old monument, is in flames. And I need to say it is really burning. I mean, it's extraordinary, these images that we're seeing out of Paris, this historic building, this place which so many people have visited. I myself have traveled to Paris many times. Notre Dame is always at the top of my list. But again, in flames right now. We understand that there are 400 firefighters battling this blaze. We're seeing reports that the general in charge of this, Jean-Claude Gallet, is saying he's not sure if this fire can be stopped, echoing the Deputy Interior Minister, who's also saying that saving the Gothic monument at this stage is just not certain. Again, seeing these images from Paris. Of course, night has fallen, but the bright flames of this fire, again, in this extraordinary building, this building, as we've been saying, which is so iconic, which so many people have visited over the years. In fact, every year, millions of people pass through that building and certainly take photos of it and have great memories of it. And yet, as we've been saying, it is in flames. Now, of course, we've been seeing throughout the evening some of those pictures that are coming out of Paris, that spire, that extraordinarily detailed spire falling in on itself. We also understand that stained glass windows are gone, the roof is gone. This is an extraordinary large fire, but as we've been saying, hundreds of firefighters are on the ground trying to contain it.
I just want to point out that the Vatican has issued a statement. The Vatican saying that the Holy See has seen with shock and sadness the news of the terrible fire that has devastated the Cathedral of Notre Dame, symbol of Christianity in France and in the world. The statement goes on to say the Vatican is praying for firefighters and those who are doing everything possible to confront this dramatic situation on Monday. It also expressed, quote, our closeness to French Catholics and the population of Paris. We are praying for firefighters. I believe this is the first time the Vatican has spoken out. Once again, of course, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, not just, a symbol of Paris and of France, but of Christianity and Catholicism. The Archbishop of Paris, his office was there in the cathedral. We have yet, I believe, to hear from him. Imtiaz, you're there in London. How is London reacting to this?
Yeah, with shock and with solidarity. We've heard from the British Prime Minister. We've also heard from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who has also expressed his grief and his sadness and, again, his solidarity with the people of France, with the people of Paris, and indeed Catholics around the world as we see this beautiful Gothic monument in flames. Now, I should say that we have heard from the Archbishop of Paris. He's called on all priests in Paris to ring the bells of their own churches as a mark, or rather as a gesture for the Notre Dame Cathedral. So you can imagine just the grief on the ground, not least for those in Paris, but indeed for believers around the world. Many who view Notre Dame as really one of the most beautiful symbols of their faith, and certainly a place that many people visit regardless of their faith. But I should say that we have been hearing from a lot of world leaders. Angela Merkel has also been speaking. We've also heard from President Trump, who has also sent out a few tweets expressing his shock at the scenes that we're seeing, suggesting that more efforts need to be made to tackle this fire. But again, as we've been saying, 400 French firefighters are on the ground trying to tackle this blaze. We do understand that some of these precious artifacts that are inside this church have been saved, have been taken out, but we don't know how many more have been lost to these fires. Now, interestingly, as we've been saying, the Notre Dame Cathedral has been going through this extraordinarily detailed and complex renovation project for some time now, about a $7 million renovation project. Just last week, on Thursday, we understand 16 priceless artifacts were taken out of the church for safekeeping. So those are certainly, some people are breathing rather a sigh of relief that those artifacts have been saved. But again, so much more has been damaged, so much more has been devastated, the cost of which at this stage is hard to calculate. But again, as we've been saying, we've been hearing from the French Interior Ministry, we've also been hearing from the French fire brigades, really saying that they're not sure that they can save this church, that this extraordinary monument, you know, from the 12th century, which has been a part of the Parisian skyline. Again, just this iconic building, that they're just not sure that they can save it in this day and age. So a very sad day for Parisians. We understand that thousands have been packing the banks of the River Seine as they watch this church burn. Just what we've been hearing from people on the ground, just standing in absolute silence, in absolute shock at what they're seeing, and no doubt people around the world just experiencing very much the same thing.
It is heartbreaking, and as you mentioned, world leaders all weighing in, tweeting. We have some sound from earlier this afternoon. President Trump was at a round table in Burnsville, Minnesota, and he mentioned Notre Dame. Let's listen.
Terrible, terrible fire. You probably saw, some of you have heard. Some of you have not because you've been here. But I will tell you the fire that they're having at the Notre Dame Cathedral is something like few people have witnessed. When we left, we had a whole group of your great representatives, and when we left the plane, it was burning at a level that you rarely see a fire burn. It's one of the great treasures of the world, the greatest artists in the world. Probably, if you think about it, I would say, Jovita, it might be greater than almost any museum in the world, and it's burning very badly. It looks like it's burning to the ground. So that puts a damper on what we're about to say, to be honest, because that is beyond countries, that's beyond anything. That's a part of our growing up. It's a part of our culture. It's a part of our lives. That's a truly great cathedral. And I've been there and I've seen it, and there's no cathedral. I think I could say there's probably no cathedral in the world like it. It's a terrible scene. They think it was caused by, at this moment they don't know, but they think it was caused by renovation. And I hope that's the reason. Renovation, you know, what's that all about? But it's a terrible sight to behold.
And Ben Howard Cooper is an American living in Paris. He joins us now on the phone. Ben, can you first tell us where you are right now and what you've seen through the course of this evening?
Hi, Tanya. I'm currently standing on the banks of the Seine on the right bank, just about 100 meters away from the Notre Dame. Starting this evening at around 7, I was sitting in my flat, and you could see the smoke start to rise. And progressively throughout the evening, it's just become even more intense, and the smoke levels have continued to rise, and you continue to see the flames engulf parts of the building. Luckily, from what I can tell, they've been able to extinguish the flames in the 2 iconic bell towers, but there's just a shell where once stood a grand backing to the cathedral.
The images are heartbreaking. How close were you able to get?
We were able to stand directly across from the island. The police had shut down the bridges at that point, but what we saw was a really heartwarming outpouring of support, people just standing in the streets singing hymns, a significant number of people just in tears, understandably, and in the city really standing around them to comfort them. Even in this time of destruction, it's nice to see the city really coming together.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for sharing your experiences with us. We're going to turn now to CBS News radio correspondent Bill Rakoff. He's been a volunteer firefighter for the past 30 years. Bill, thank you so much for speaking with us again. Can you tell us a little bit about what these firefighters are up against right now, and what's been the arc of fighting this fire for them?
Well, it almost looks as if the die may have been cast before they even really got on the scene. As you could see, there were a couple of factors early on with some of the earliest video of this. The spire was already involved somewhat in fire, and there was a significant amount of fire on the roof. Add to that a pretty good wind that was pushing the smoke column, as you could see, toward the front of the cathedral there, and what that will do is it will push the fire as well. And that was the first bit of bad luck that they had there because, had that fire or the wind been blowing another direction, not saying it would have happened, but they might have had a chance to keep that fire contained to the rear of the cathedral, but no such luck. It was tearing through some of this very old construction. We're talking about, the trusses of the building that were hundreds of years old, tinder dry wood that could go up just like that. And for that reason, they weren't going to send anybody into the building too far. Again, they also had a logistical issue of trying to get high enough. I'm looking at some of the video now of some of the streams trying to go into that building, Tanya. If you notice, they're shooting up at it, which means they can't get above it to shoot down inside. So while they're getting water onto the fire, it's not having as good an effect as they would be if somehow they could get on top with those master streams. But those walls are just too high for any fire apparatus to do that.
Why aren't they using any sort of helicopters or any of that we see, in California wildfires, for instance?
Well, one reason they don't do that is because in an urban environment, it can be very dangerous. They're not precise drops. I mean, it's not like you're trying to drop a bomb through a scope. When they're flying over, they release the water, but there's also a chance you might cause damage or injuries to people who are standing around the scene. So airdrops like that are extremely unusual in this sort of situation and not really applicable. It's one of the things that I've been asked a lot this afternoon about. Would it have made a difference if somebody had done that? It may have, but again, it's a difficult thing. This fire in such an old building with such a big space, it got the jump on firefighters, and sometimes firefighters will tell you they pride themselves in being able to go in and put the fire out, but sometimes they get there, and like I said, the die is already cast.
Right, so it's a little too difficult to do those airdrops in an urban environment. That makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about the difficulty of fighting a fire in a church?
Yeah, and it's extremely dangerous because you have a huge open space, first of all, in most churches. Even the smaller churches have high ceilings, in many of them. And so they have situations where the wood gets involved, and it becomes a really risky proposition, to send firefighters inside to save it. We've got an old saying in the fire service, you'll risk a lot to save a lot.
Right.
In other words, if there's a life in danger, if there'd been somebody inside, there would have been heroic efforts made to try to get somebody out of there. You can almost bet. But if everybody was out in a fire like this when you pull up, the best thing you can do is take stock. And sometimes you have to make strategic decisions. I mean, with the roof going like that, it may very well be that the incident commanders there said, look, we're going to make the strategic decision to let the roof go, and we're going to see if we can't stop it, from causing damage on the inside. But once you have a series of collapses like that, you've got all that material now down in the nave of the cathedral, and it's just cooking in there. And anything that was there are also construction materials inside, causing lots of damage down there. So these buildings present a particular damage, and as I think I mentioned to you earlier this afternoon, they can be deadly because now what they're doing, in addition to spraying water, they're watching the walls. They want to make sure that the integrity of the walls around the cathedral are safe to prevent more injury and possible death to firefighters.
Absolutely. And the reports that we're hearing, there have been no deaths. I'm assuming you're hearing the same thing, which to me all seems amazing and wonderful, because if this is a typical, day in Paris at the cathedral, there may have been hundreds and hundreds of tourists inside the church when this fire began.
There could have been, and if in fact, and we don't know this yet, but if in fact the fire did start on the roof and somebody noticed it quickly, that would have given them some time, because it takes time, for that fire to get going hot enough that it's going to burn through the roof and start dropping material into the nave. So if somebody saw it right away and there were people inside, the good news is they would have been able to get people out fairly quickly, and it looks like that's what happened here today. And again, in terms of the first responders who are there and the Paris firefighters, they're keeping a very respectful distance here. And I mean, even the folks who are in the aerial pieces aren't getting too close. They establish what they call a perimeter, a collapse perimeter, so that in case something does happen, they're well away from any danger if it does.
And we did, Bill, get another tiny bit of good news from Christophe Girard, the deputy mayor of Paris. He told us that they were able to get some trucks up to the cathedral and get some artwork out before the worst part of the fire.
And that is great news because, you know, I mean, that's going to be on the minds of firefighters. Look, because they're firefighters, but they're also Parisians, and some of them may be Catholic. And so this is going to hit close to home for them. And believe me, they understand whether it's the house fire and somebody wants their wedding jewelry protected, or you've got the works of arts inside the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Firefighters will do what they can to try to save those things. And believe me, they understand the importance. So the fact that they were able to get some things out is heartwarming to hear. I'm really hopeful that the damages are limited. But, you know, just looking at what we're seeing on the video here, even though they were able to get some things out, I fear that the damages just could be huge.
Oh, it is absolutely heartbreaking. These images have just really just seared into the minds of everyone who loves Paris, who loves great architecture, who loves Notre Dame. It's been a devastating afternoon. Bill Rakoff, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I want to read now a tweet from former President Barack Obama. He writes, Notre Dame is one of the world's great treasures, and we're thinking of the people of France in your time of grief. It's in our nature to mourn when we see history lost, but it's also in our nature to rebuild for tomorrow as strong as we can. And I do want to point out that the deputy mayor of Paris did tell us earlier that their thoughts have already turned to rebuilding. So that is heartening. He says they've received offers of help from people all around the world that want to help Paris rebuild Notre Dame. Alex Marshall is a Paris-based journalist, and he joins us now. Alex, can you tell us about the significance of this iconic building and describe the current of emotions that are running through Paris right now?
Hi, it's Alexandra, actually.
Oh, sorry.
The significance of this building, it's difficult to even put it into words. I mean, it's been there for 800 years. It's the center of not just Paris, but all of France. It's where the basis of